just admiring the magic because Shane just said I would walk up here and the music. I thought it was kind of cool that I'm Deborah Norden. I'm a professor in the political science department, and it's my honor to be here today to, first of all, welcome all of you to the 2016 Feinberg Lecture, both those of you who are here with us in the Shannon Center and those of us who are joining us through live streaming. The Feinberg Lecture series was generously endowed by the Feinberg family, I think more than 2 decades ago, to bring to Whittier College major scholars and leaders who can address important historic, religious, and political issues related to Judaism and the role of Judaism in the world. Some of our notable past speakers include Justice Richard Goldstone, Dr. Judea Pearl, Senator George Mitchell, U.S. Ambassador to Israel and Egypt Daniel Kurtzer, and Holocaust historian Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, amongst others. And we will have a wonderful addition to that list today with Robin Wright. Robin is a familiar face to many, if not everybody here. She is a longtime illustrious journalist, television commentator, and a very well-known expert on the Middle East. She is a prolific author, if I counted right, with 6 books, and with the lights I can't even see if that was correct or not, including Rock the Casbah, Rage and Rebellion Across the Islamic World, which will be available in the lobby after the talk, and she's agreed to sign books very kindly. She has written for the most respected news publications in the United States, including the Los Angeles Times, of course you have to include that, Washington Post, New York Times Magazine, Foreign Affairs, and numerous other publications. She's been the recipient of many prestigious awards. I am cutting this CV so short that it seems like a shame, but I know you want to hear her instead of me. The awards include the UN Correspondents Gold Medal Award, the National Magazine Award, the Overseas Press Club Award. She's written on everything from the Islamic State very recently, the fight to defeat it, Iranian politics in quite a bit of depth, Cuban communism, and I was a little bemused to see an article on pandas on her blog, which I strongly recommend. She brings depth to her study of journalism, and from her journalism and her investigation of the world over numerous years from her studies as a historian, that if you read her work or hear her statements, it's very clear that that depth is there, and that knowledge that is accumulated both from her own experiences as well as her studies. So before I turn to Robin, I'd like to briefly acknowledge those who made tonight possible, not so good with microphones, to the Feinberg family. Thank you so much for your generous support for this invaluable lecture series over the years. In particular, Jamie Simmons, who is here tonight, as well as Betty Feinberg, Randy Feinberg, Laura Feinberg-Caney, and college trustee Peter Feinberg. Their generosity and frequently their wonderful speaker suggestions, which has always helped us out, have created some amazing opportunities for the Whittier College community. I'd also like to thank Steve Delgado and the Advancement Office, who managed all of the logistics for this event, and to Robin Wright for joining us here today. Robin's talk is entitled Rock the Casbah, the Future of the Middle East. And I want to let you know she will be taking questions after her talk, so we'll have an opportunity to engage with her further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be at Whittier College. I believe so much in the principles. They're at the core of your value system, the core of your mission, in coexistence and brotherhood and understanding people of all faiths and all races and ethnicities, and creating a communal environment. Now, I have 55 minutes to tell you about the most turbulent part of the world. So, I brought a map because I love maps, and I often think it's much easier to kind of visualize something as I'm talking about it. I want to do two things. I want to give you 10 bottom lines about the whole region, and then I want to talk about 8 countries. And I know my assignment is in part to talk about Israel and Judaism and so forth, but I thought it would be very useful to kind of stand back and look at how this region is changing and how that in turn is going to affect Israel. I just have returned a week ago today. I was in northern Iraq on the front line, waving right in front of me. This is a time, in light of what's happened in Brussels in the past week, of great uncertainty and obviously great fears. The Islamic State has changed the nature of warfare even more than Al-Qaeda did. So let me stand back for a minute and give you an overview, what I think are the 10 bottom lines in the region today. The first, obviously, that this is a greater period of uncertainty than we've had, not just in decades. It's probably one of the 3 most tumultuous moments in the past century. It's a time that the region is literally being redefined. The Arab Spring of 2011, 5 years later, has become the Arab earthquake. The second bottom line is that politically, the uprisings unleashed something very hopeful for all of us, and that is a sense of rights. That the Middle East became part and parcel of the broader global trend we've witnessed over the last 40 years, as people, whether it's in Southern Africa standing up against apartheid and minority rule, or in Latin America standing up against military dictatorships, or in Eastern Europe standing up against communism. There is a sense that people understand the trends politically elsewhere. They want to be part of it. That's the hopeful side. But my third bottom line is that there's a second half to this phenomena. Having rights is something we as a nation fought for. But we also had to learn in a tumultuous way that there's a second half of that process, and that's developing a sense of common good and responsibility to balance rights. And we're in the purgatory, the twilight, between that period when people in the region understand they have rights in autocratic systems and to fight back against it. But they don't understand, they don't embrace that fundamental commitment to a common good. My fourth bottom line is that political Islam is on the run in places where it emerged through democratic elections, in Tunisia and Egypt. That's something that we in the West probably are happier about. We see parties we didn't understand, that we didn't always think were as committed to democratic principles, losing their place in society. The problem is that there's a yin and a yang, and in place of political Islam, we're seeing growing extremist Islam. The Islamic State, in creating a caliphate, has gone far further than Al-Qaeda ever did. Al-Qaeda wanted to challenge the West, but it thought that only down the road, decades, centuries, somewhere in the future, would there be a global Muslim community. The Islamic State is trying to create it today, and that's the other, again, the yin and the yang. My fifth bottom line is that in this moment where we're seeing political transitions, There are extraordinary factors that are hopeful, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. The problem is that they are not yet mature enough to create alternatives. And so we see the kind of polarization of forces, not like any country we live in. That you see the this polarization so that there's no viable middle, no appealing middle offering alternatives, creating alternatives. The kids are too young, the kids who protested and took to the streets to challenge autocratic rule. They don't have the networks, the resources. They don't have the political parties that know how to campaign, how to create and offer alternatives. We're still a generation or more away from that. My sixth bottom line is that the Arab Spring was not really about liberal democracy. It was really much more initially about jobs and opportunity and justice. The young fruit vendor who set himself on fire 5 years ago to protest corruption after a government inspector seized his fruit for refusing to pay a bribe. He wasn't demanding liberal democracy. He was demanding the right to support his family, his 5 siblings, his mother, and his ailing uncle. And when the government took away his ability to support himself, he protested by setting himself on fire. Those fundamental issues still define the political and social environment across the region, these fundamental economic issues of mere survival. My seventh bottom line is that the young, who constitute anywhere from 60 to 72% of the populations across the region, today feel very disillusioned. They feel that what they tried to inspire across the region never got far enough, and that the systems that replace the autocrats have failed to deliver. And this is something that plagues even the rich countries in places like Saudi Arabia, where the young, 1/3 of the young in oil-rich Saudi Arabia are unemployed. That's something that's not sustainable long-term. My eighth bottom line is that in this vacuum of the moment, and that's what it is, it's not going to be there forever. It's again that twilight zone, that purgatory of trying to move beyond something and not having the means, the mechanisms, the resources to do it. That we see basic identities, because there's no alternative, because nationalism has failed, because ideologies have failed, people return to their primordial identities, whether it's of ethnicity or religion. And that means that sectarianism has deepened across the region. You could almost say that the difference, particularly between Sunnis and Shiites, the 2 major branches of Islam, are deeper or as deep as at any time since the faith was founded 14 centuries ago. My ninth bottom line is that the turmoil in the region has reached the point that this map we're looking at today may not be as it is today in a decade. I'd almost bet money on it. I think there are places that, whether it's the dismantlement of Syria because it's no longer sustainable, or the breakup of Iraq, again, not because of as much because of warfare, but just because communities want to protect themselves and they feel only their communities can do that. My final bottom line applies to the United States. In the 21st century, one of the themes will be that whoever is president has nothing to do with politics. That one of the themes of the 21st century is not just democracy within countries, it's also democracy among countries. And that the kind of power we have had since the end of World War II probably will not prevail. That we are going to have to be, we will be the major player, but we may not be a superpower. We will have to share power with others in order, as globalization takes root, to be part of wider communities, whether it's NATO in fighting wars, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership to engage in trade, that this is just something that's going to happen. And so our ability, when it comes to some of these conflict zones, to have an impact on what we want to happen may not be as effective or as appealing, that we will increasingly need partners to do that. Our ability as a lone nation to determine what happens next will diminish. So let me very quickly take you through a tour of the region and the individual countries to give you a sense of what's happening within each one of them. Tunisia, let's begin there, in North Africa, which was the place that gave us the Arab Spring, this great inspiration. Not only the young fruit vendor, but the young rapper who used rap to define the rhythm of resistance, who wrote a song that challenged the autocratic rule of President Ben Ali, who'd been around for more than 2 decades, talking about the young who were not literate even though they'd been in school, the families who were feeding themselves off the garbage on the streets. And he put it on Facebook, and 20% of the population in Tunisia were on Facebook. And his song became the anthem of the uprising. It was not just one individual, it was a much broader phenomenon. And in Tunisia, in the last 5 years, we've seen some very hopeful developments. They have written the most democratic constitution, the best constitution in the Arab world. It talks about gender equality, something that's hasn't defined the region ever. It talks about equal rights. It defines specifically. And they went through a process of town halls and a national debate that mirrored our own in trying to define what it was that would define the new political system. It is a wonderfully hopeful and the most hopeful example of change in the Middle East. The problem is that those same issues of opportunity and jobs have not been addressed. I went to the town in Tunisia, Sidi Bouzid, where the young fruit vendor set himself on fire a year after his death. And there's a big marble statue in his honor that shows his fruit cart toppling thrones, a symbol of all the autocracies across the region. And on the sides in English and French and Arabic it says, "For those who yearn to be free." It's a great inspiration. And then I went across the street to the cafe. It's right across from a huge billboard of the picture of the young fruit vendor. And I asked the young men there, "So, a year later, what do you think?" And they all had similar things to say. We have many more freedoms, but far fewer jobs. It is providing that sense of opportunity that is as important as changing the political environment for the people of the region. If you can't feed your family, if you can't feel invested in the system, you're going to turn against it. And little Tunisia, 11 million people, has provided more fighters to ISIS than any other Arab country. Almost 5,000. And another 9,000 have been turned back by security forces, prevented from leaving the country. It's a real conundrum. A country that is the symbol of hope and that hasn't yet delivered what people expected of what was known as the Jasmine Revolution. So let me turn to Libya. Big Libya. It should have been the greatest success. This is a country that has only 6 million people and all that territory and a lot of oil. It is the one country that could afford to create those jobs and that sense of opportunity. And I have to tell you, I feel particularly and personally saddened about Libya because Chris Stevens, our ambassador in Tripoli, was one of my closest friends. And a week before his death, we'd emailed back and forth. He urged me to come visit, and I'd finally gotten a visa and was headed out. And the last message I had from him was, "See you next week." I went to Libya, and Chris, as you know, was one of the 4 Americans who died in the attack. The tragedy of Libya was that the world mobilized together to stand up to Gaddafi, to make sure that he didn't engage in genocide against his own people. The problem is that we didn't follow through. We were willing to use our military might to oust him. And I interviewed Gaddafi several times, and he was as loopy as he looked. I often said he wore heels that were higher than mine. I interviewed him in his tent in a military barracks. And it was fascinating to go back to Tripoli and find that barracks had been totally leveled. The problem was we didn't create an alternative. This is something, we are well-intentioned as a nation. We do want to do good. We do want to see other nations, other peoples thrive, have that sense of opportunity. But we're not very good about figuring out how to do it, about nation building. And we used our military might very effectively in forcing Gaddafi from power. And then we and our European allies particularly, and the Europeans even more than us because the status of Libya affects them far more than it affects us, really failed to help the Libyans follow through. And during the 8 months of that military campaign, there were dozens and dozens of militias that were formed to fight Gaddafi. And in the vacuum, if you hear me use that word again and again, there's a reason. And in that vacuum, without an alternative, the militias thrived. And they became the alternative. And we are today still dealing with that aftermath. And in the vacuum of all those militias, ISIS also got a stronghold. And Libya is today considered the first colony of ISIS, because not only do you have the different militias loyal to Tripoli in one part of the country and Benghazi on the other, but you have ISIS now with its capital in Sirte, which is Muammar Gaddafi's old hometown. There is hope that there is a UN effort to try to bring the forces together. There is a nascent alternative government, unity government, that is taking shape. The problem is that they are not the only players anymore, that 5 years later, ISIS is there too. And as we've learned everywhere, trying to deal with this extraordinary change and stabilize societies is made all the harder when you have ISIS extremists trying to undermine and destabilize environments. So let me turn to Egypt. Egypt, the most important political trendsetter in the region, accounting for 1/4 of the Arab world's 350 million people. It was the first country to make peace with Israel in the Arab world. It produced some of the most popular, if not always for us appealing, ideologies in the region. Egypt looked like it was making tremendous headway once Hosni Mubarak stepped down. For the first time in over 5,000 years, it held democratic elections. Things didn't go so well. The Muslim Brotherhood was elected. It didn't know how to rule. It was clumsy and often repressive. A year later, Egypt went through a second military coup, and now you have a former field marshal who's in power, and in many ways as abusive as Hosni Mubarak was. There are over 1,400 people who've been sentenced to death. some of them in arbitrary trials. More than 10,000 have been detained and picked up. And the problem is, for Egypt, even more than some of these numbers, that it still hasn't created that sense of opportunity, that unemployment is only growing in a repressive environment, foreign investment has dried up, tourism has dried up, and as a result you're seeing the emergence of an ISIS branch in the Sinai. And we saw the downing of a Russian passenger plane off the Sinai. This is, in some ways the big question for me is Egypt still waiting for its real revolution? Is more to come? Because the status quo, long term, is not a solution. Short term, it provides a false sense of stability, but it isn't an answer. So, let me turn to Syria. Syria is the most complicated war in the world today. It's not just one war, it's 4 wars. There's the war that started with the dissidents uprising against Bashar Assad, a group of teenagers, 13 and 14 years old, who wrote anti-government graffiti on walls in a remote Syrian town. And when they were picked up by security forces, the people in this remote town called Dara took to the streets to protest. And in the environment of the Arab Spring, it took off, and hundreds of thousands and then millions began to take to the streets. But Bashar Assad saw what happened in other countries, and so he moved quickly to use military force against his own people. And that quickly turned into a civil war. You have the second war that was started when ISIS took root and seized 1/3 of Syria with breathtaking speed in that vacuum in 2014. The third conflict is the proxy war that has played out between whether it's the United States and Russia backing different sides, or Saudi Arabia and Iran backing different sides in this conflict. And the fourth war is something I talked about earlier, and that's in this vacuum, the emergence of those primordial identities. They give people sustenance. The sectarian Shiites versus Sunnis. Syria's war is so important to understand and to try to resolve because it is the strategic center of the Middle East. Its borders overlap some of the most sensitive regions, sensitive countries in the most sensitive crises. And so anything that happens in Syria has a spillover effect across the Middle East. The problem, of course, is that there is no military solution in Syria. There is a peace process that began in January. There is a ceasefire that began last month. It's not perfect. The peace process is going to take a long time. This one round may not work. It may be that they have to regroup at some later point. But there is a recognition, at least internationally, that this has to be resolved peacefully. In the end, that the military solution, because there are so many players, is not really a viable alternative. But in the meantime, the Syrian war has produced the greatest humanitarian crisis since World War II. Over half the country is now dependent on aid for daily survival. Almost 5 million people have fled the country. Another 7 million are displaced inside the country. Turkey has taken in over 2 million. Lebanon, 1.2 million. Literally, in a country, Lebanon is the size of Connecticut. Its population is 4 million, and it's taken in 1.2 million refugees. It's just overwhelmed them. And again, created a terrible sense of effort, which is not even on the same continent, has taken in over 150,000. In Jordan, the fourth largest city today is a Syrian refugee camp. The question long-term about Syria, and this gets back to one of my bottom lines, is whether it can even hold together now. Whether one of the solutions is, whether it's the formal breakup or the decentralization of Syria as its communities go its own way, whether Syria can hold together. And there's a growing sense in Washington that it may not be able to. And if it isn't able to hold together, what impact does that then have on other parts of the region? So let me turn to Iraq, where I was last week. This is a country where the United States invested $2 trillion in ousting Saddam Hussein and trying to create an alternative. It cost us 4,500 American lives, and 130,000 Iraqis died during this process. Now, there is good news out of Iraq. ISIS has proven that it is not invincible. One of the things that's really striking over the last 3 months is that ISIS has lost 40% of the territory it held in Iraq, 10% of the territory it held in Syria. It is vulnerable. It is losing territory. The United States and its coalition partners, more than 60 nations, have engaged in airstrikes that have killed, on average, 1,000 ISIS fighters a month. Last year, the great challenge was ISIS had 25,000 to 30,000 fighters, and even as the United States picked them off, they still were able to recruit those numbers. Today, the numbers are down, and the communications that are being tapped by American intelligence are all about trying to rally people to fight, trying to rally them to get others to join the cause. Their numbers are down. They're not nearly as capable of recruiting people. And some of its messages actually are go to Libya instead of coming to Syria. There's a sense that in the next year, we may be able, with our Iraqi partners and the Kurdish militia in the north, to force ISIS out of Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, which would then force them out of their biggest stronghold, the two big strongholds that ISIS has, Raqqa, its capital in Syria, and Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq. These are the two cities to pay attention to. If ISIS loses those, it's basically finished as a state. It will be unable to administer. It may turn into cells. It will still be dangerous. But it will have lost that psychological edge, that political entity, being able to say, we have a 21st century caliphate. That's the good news. The problem in Iraq is that those issues that were visible in 2003, right after our intervention, sharing power, Sunni, Shiites, and Kurds, dividing oil revenues equitably, proportionately, and fairly among Shiites and Sunnis and Kurds, all these years later, still have not been addressed. And there are a sense of, in that vacuum, a sense that people are not willing to hold together in a single Iraqi state. The two countries that will be most decisive in deciding the map of the Middle East, and what it looks like a decade from now, are in Syria and Iraq. And one of the problems is we've turned the corner in Iraq. We used to talk about it breaking up into three pieces based on rival ethnicities or religions. Today, it's something different, that the state in many ways has atrophied. They all want to have common cause when it comes to fighting ISIS, getting rid of it. The big question is, will they fight to stay together? Or will each community feel that at the end of the day, once they get rid of ISIS, that they will want to break up into their own pieces to protect their own? This is the big question, and we don't have answers now. but it's one of the things that will be critical in looking at what does the region look like, and will we go through the greatest change in a century? Because this is the year we celebrate the 100th anniversary of Sykes-Picot, that European agreement that divided the Middle East up after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the end of World War II. So let me turn to Iran. I've been to Iran probably more than any American since the revolution. I've been going almost every year and sometimes twice a year since 1973. I've interviewed its 5 most recent presidents, including the Supreme Leader. This is still very much a revolutionary society. The Iranian intelligence branch of the Revolutionary Guards hacked my computer. They got not only my email, my Facebook, and my Twitter account, they even took my Uber account for reasons that are a little unclear to me. When I called an Uber account, the driver showed up and he looked at me and he said, "You're not Abu Rasul." The good news out of Iran is that we have a nuclear deal. I'm a great believer that diplomacy was a better way out than another Middle East war, which I think would have been far more complicated than both Iraq and Afghanistan combined, for a lot of reasons that have to do with not just the numbers of the population, but Persian nationalism. I often tell people if they want to understand Iran and Iranians, to think of their most chauvinistic Texan and add 5,000 years. And then you begin to understand Iranian nationalism. The nuclear deal took us from the brink of war to a point that we can talk to Iranians about the issues, notably Syria. In many ways, we're beginning to see byproduct benefits of that agreement. Not just that Iran will be limited for the next 15, 20, and 25 years in key elements of its nuclear program, but we'll also be able to bring them into a process that will make them less our nemesis and make them invested in finding solutions. It is in their interests to find a solution to the Syrian conflict, even though they have backed Bashar al-Assad. War is not in their interest long term. But the nuclear deal reflected something much more important about what's happening inside Iran almost 2 generations after the end of since its revolution in 1979. It's very interesting, and it has to do with the demographics, something that's happening in the region, but far more so in Iran. After the revolution, the clerics called on Iranian women to breed an Islamic generation. And boy, did they. The population doubled in a decade. And the clerics began to understand, oops, we can't feed, clothe, house, educate, and eventually employ all those numbers. So they introduced what was the most effective birth control program in the world. Everything was free. Condoms, Norplant, tubal ligation, vasectomy, the pill. The big water tower in Tehran, in Farsi and English, said, vasectomy clinic, here. They brought the population birth rate down very quickly from just over 6 children per family to replacement level. But what that did was create a decade baby boom that will be far disproportionate to what we went through, and that will follow Iran for the next 40 to 50 years as the dominant element of their population. Over half of the electorate today has been born since the revolution. They're under 35. They're connected. And like Cuba, their greatest success was educating their people. Iran won the highest award from the United Nations for closing the gender gap between girls and boys in education. And we all know what happens when you educate girls. But it has created a very dynamic young generation that's not interested in talking about the ideal Islamic State. They're interested in startups. When I was in Iran last year, I went to see the young twins, early 30s, who have started the Amazon of Iran, worth over $150 million. They sell Steinway pianos and Japanese electronics and French perfume, and they'll deliver it to your door the day you order it. I talked to the young 26-year-old Iranian woman who started the Groupon of Iran. The nuclear deal reflected the political change, the political dynamics that have shifted inside the Islamic Republic because of the change in its own society. And the clerics, who are now in their 70s and 80s, understand that for the system to survive, they have to bring the young along with them. And that means re-engaging with the world. And the first step was a nuclear deal. Now, I'm not trying to say everything's going to be roses. This is a revolutionary environment. It feels deeply vulnerable. It's meddling in virtually every Middle East country. But the nuclear deal prevented a conflict and hopefully set us on a different course, as uneven and difficult as that's going to be. The United States today indicted a number of Iranians for cyber attacks, not only on American banks, but on a dam in New York. They will be up to mischief. They will undermine our interests and challenge us versus virtually everywhere. But at the same time, the idea of regime change is not a viable alternative at the moment. And if we have to deal with the regime, it's better to have done a nuclear deal that prevents, at least for a certain period of time, particularly time when that young generation is going to move increasingly through society, where the original revolutionaries are going to die out. And then, if Iran cheats, the United States still has the military option. If it smuggles, if it tries to engage in any violations of that accord, with international approval, we can take military action that will be much more viable than it would have been if we had to do it alone. Now I want to get back to what does this mean for Israel? Isn't it an extraordinary moment that all of the challenges in the Middle East don't include the Arab-Israeli conflict? It's almost a backwater issue, tragically, today, because there are so many bigger challenges. You look at Israel's borders, and it has unstable Syria to the north. It has Lebanon, where Hezbollah has become war-hardened after fighting in Syria, better armed than ever. You have Egypt to the south, where the Sinai is a hotbed of extremism, where one of the branches of ISIS has taken root, where the group is strong enough to shoot down a Russian passenger plane. And then vulnerable Jordan, which has been overwhelmed by Palestinian refugees, Iraqi refugees, and now Syrian refugees. The Hashemite kingdom has always been vulnerable, and there are a lot of questions about how much more vulnerable is it now. It is an irony that, by comparison, the Palestinians, at least the border with the West Bank, is less volatile, as hot as it is, than some of Israel's other borders. Now, we're getting to a point that, with the leadership, particularly among the Palestinians, getting to the point that they are either unpopular, not viable, or just aging. That it's hard to see how they will anytime soon make peace. There is still a margin of Palestinians, according to a poll that came out this week, who still want to see the two-state solution, 51%. But 48% are no longer in favor of a two-state solution. And that's a really dangerous turning point. Among Israelis, 40% do not think the Israeli government is making a sincere effort toward peace, but 88% don't think the Palestinians are making a sincere effort toward peace. The gap, we got so close so many times, and the gap seems to be widening yet again. I don't rule out the prospect of a peace process. I think we all know what it would look like. The question is, how do we get there? I'm not sure that the Obama administration has much of a chance before the end of its term. And there are so many things that are fluid in the region that it's not clear whether the next president, Democrat or Republican, Republican or Democrat, will have the resources to invest in that process given all the other challenges in the region. And of course, it's not just about two parties. It's not just about the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, and the Israelis. You have Hamas, that third branch, which dominates in Gaza. And as bad as Hamas may seem to many, ISIS is beginning to get a foothold. We don't know how strong, but we know that there are cells that have developed in Gaza. And the really worst thing for Israel down the road would be for the Palestinians, those who have, in the case of the Palestinian Authority, in the case of the PLO, been willing to recognize Israel and work on a peace process, or Hamas to at least run in elections, to have ISIS suddenly emerge as more popular in that vacuum without peace. Now, I want to leave time for questions, so let me wrap up by telling you I'm actually not very pessimistic about the future. Honest. I think that one of the things that's hard for us to do, and as an historian, my dad always told me, he was a wonderful law professor, very colorful character, and he always told his students and his kids, if you want to understand something, stand on top of the world and look down. And that's what I always try to do. And I do think that we have reached some really important turning points in the region. And the factors that inspired the Arab Spring, that inspired people to demand their rights, that have led people to call for democratic reforms and political openings, haven't changed. The majority of the young in the Middle East, in the Arab world, for the first time are literate, the majority of them, and that includes girls with one exception. Education has given them a means of getting beyond their own neighborhood, their own village, their own town, their own country, to see what's happening elsewhere in the world, to get a sense of what's changing and what they want to be part of. As I said, rap was the rhythm of resistance. They know what's happening elsewhere. They're connected. Facebook and social media have been critical in all of these inspiring movements for change. And that's not going to change. Secondly, the idea of diversity has for the first time taken root in the region. In 1995, we saw the emergence of Al Jazeera as the first independent satellite television station in their own language that circumvented state control, that gave people a sense of what was happening in the region. It was instrumental in the Arab Spring in educating people about what was happening in Tunisia, Egypt, and beyond. What's fascinating is that today there are 500 independent satellite television stations in the Middle East. And they have different news programs, different talk shows, different soap operas, different religious programs with different clerics who issue different fatwas. There is no sense of one truth, one path, one way anymore. There is this generation that is educated, that's the majority in every country, now understands that principle of diversity. We have seen the beginning. The problem is, we want to see it like a light switch. You turn it on, and there it is. And that's not the way it's going to happen. And in some ways, the West was culpable in tolerating a lot of autocrats in the name of stability, longer than we should have, and longer still for some of those who are still in power. As a result, you don't have that middle that emerged in civil society, that had networks, that formed alternative parties, that tapped into nationalist and liberal ideas, and I mean that liberal with small l, not big, the ideas of democracy. And as a result, they haven't had the opportunities. The odds are greater against them. It will take them longer. But there's no question that these factors are going to be defining the region in the 21st century. It will be turbulent, there's no question. But they have begun a process of change that I think will, in the end of the day, make a huge difference and lead in a direction we find more positive. And I'll just close by saying, change takes a long time everywhere. I was in South Africa in 1976. I was in Soweto when the uprising began against apartheid. And I went back 15 years later and watched Nelson Mandela walk to freedom. You know, the Rainbow Nation inspired us all. But the truth is that today South Africa is worse off than the average South African is worse off than he was under apartheid. The average lifespan is today a decade shorter than it was when Nelson Mandela walked to freedom. We celebrated the end of the Soviet Union a quarter century ago. Hard to believe, seems like yesterday. And yet we have in power in Moscow a former KGB officer who may be in power till 2024, and increasingly looks like he wants the powers of a czar. Change takes a long time everywhere, and the Middle East is no exception. So as we stand on top of the world and look down, I would just urge you to remember that at the end of the day, the government is going to protect them, look after them, provide them services. We've discovered in the last 40 years that those are common denominators that bind us all and define what it is we want in life. The Middle East is no exception, but it's going to be a long, difficult ride, bumpy ride, traumatic ride, with a lot of ugly headlines in between. But I think it's the beginning of a process that at the end of the day actually has some hope. ISIS may have 25,000 fighters, but there are 350 million people in the Arab world, and the majority have not joined ISIS. So let me offer you a chance to ask your questions and let me know what's on your mind. And I thank you very much.